The fluorescent lights in the hotel lobby flickered twice just after midnight, the way they always did when the storm rolled in off Lake Michigan. Vera Calloway had worked the overnight desk at the Alderton Grand for 2 years, long enough to know every sound the old building made, every guest who came through at odd hours, every shadow that didn't quite belong. She knew which elevators groaned on the way up and which creaked on the way down. She knew that the heating vents in the east wing hissed like something alive when the temperature dropped below 30. She knew how to look busy while watching everything. It was a skill she'd developed out of necessity, not ambition. The lobby was quiet tonight, the kind of quiet that felt heavy, deliberate. A businessman in a rumpled suit had checked in around 11, barely making eye contact. 2 women from a conference on the 14th floor had come down for ice and gone back up 20 minutes ago. The bar had closed at midnight, and the bartender, a soft-spoken man named Gerald, who always left her a wrapped piece of chocolate at the end of his shift, had already gone home. Vera was alone at the front desk, the glow of the computer screen reflecting off her glasses, when the revolving door pushed open and the cold air came rushing in ahead of them. 4 men entered. She felt the shift before she fully processed it, the way you feel a change in pressure before thunder. The first man through the door was in his early 40s, silver beginning to thread through his dark hair, dressed in a charcoal overcoat that had clearly never seen the inside of a department store. He moved like someone who had never needed to hurry because the world simply waited for him. Behind him came 3 others, positioned with a precision that had nothing to do with coincidence. They weren't checking in. Vera could tell that much immediately. Their eyes moved the wrong way. Not up at the chandeliers, not toward the bar, not the way tourists' eyes moved. These eyes went to exits, to corners, to the one security camera above the concierge desk that had been broken for 6 weeks and that management kept promising to replace. The man in the overcoat walked to the far end of the lobby, toward the cluster of wingback chairs near the fireplace that was always kept burning through November. His companions arranged themselves without being told. One near the elevator bank, one facing the revolving door, one at an angle that covered both. Vera kept her eyes on her screen and reached for her pen. She had checked in a guest 40 minutes ago, a quiet man, 50s, who had paid cash and asked twice whether the hotel had security cameras in the stairwells. She'd told him yes because that was what she was supposed to say, even though the honest answer was more complicated than that. He'd taken his key card and gone up to the 4th floor. She thought about that now. She thought about the phone call she'd taken an hour earlier. It had come through the hotel line, which was unusual, and the voice on the other end had asked if a certain party had arrived yet. She'd said she couldn't share guest information. The voice had paused and then said quietly that it wasn't a question about a guest, it was a question about a target. The line had gone dead before she could respond. Vera had almost called her supervisor. Almost. But her supervisor had gone home at 10, and the night manager was somewhere on the upper floors doing rounds, and the truth was that she didn't know who to call or what to say. She'd heard a strange phone call. She'd checked in a man paying cash. She'd watched 4 men with expensive coats arrange themselves around her lobby like chess pieces. None of it was proof of anything, and yet, she thought about her brother Teddy, who was 17 and asthmatic and currently asleep in their apartment 12 blocks away, where the radiator clanged and the window lock on the fire escape had been broken since September. She thought about how she worked this shift 6 nights a week, because the overnight differential meant an extra $4 an hour, and how that $4 an hour was the difference between Teddy's inhaler prescription getting filled or not. She thought about how small her world had become in the last 3 years, and how carefully she'd constructed it. She'd almost succeeded in making herself invisible. Almost. The man in the overcoat, seated now near the fireplace with a glass of water one of his companions had fetched from the self-serve station, glanced up. His eyes found her across the lobby. They were dark, very still, the kind of eyes that processed everything without revealing anything in return. He didn't look away, neither did she. After a moment he nodded, slightly, the way you acknowledge a person you've registered but haven't yet decided what to do about. Then he returned to the low conversation he was having with the man beside him. Vera looked back at her screen. Her fingers typed nothing. She was running numbers in her head. The cash guest on the 4th floor, the phone call, the voice that said target, the men at the door who had checked every exit, the timing of it all. She was not a dramatic person. She'd had drama carved out of her by years of keeping her head down, of making herself small and useful and unremarkable. She was the person who refilled the lobby's complimentary coffee station and updated the lost and found log and smiled at guests who didn't look at her. She was furniture that spoke, but she had also spent 3 years watching the people around her with the particular attention of someone who had learned, the hard way, that most disasters announce themselves before they happen. You just had to be paying attention. She pulled a hotel notepad from the drawer beneath the desk, the kind with the Alderton Grand letterhead in gold at the top. She wrote 4 words and a number, tore the sheet off, and folded it once. Then she picked up a bottle of sparkling water from the mini-fridge behind her, put it on a small tray with a cocktail napkin and a wrapped mint, and crossed the lobby. "Compliments of the hotel," she said, setting the tray on the low table beside the man in the overcoat. Her voice was steady. She'd trained it to be. "I noticed you came in without stopping at the bar. We like to make sure our guests feel taken care of." He looked at the tray, then at her. "I'm not a guest," he said. His voice was low and measured, Italian accent, slight, the kind that comes from someone who learned English young but kept the original music underneath. "I know," Vera said. She set the folded note beside the water glass and walked back to her desk without looking back. Her heart was doing something unpleasant against her ribs. She kept her expression neutral and opened the lost and found log and pretended to read an entry about a left-behind umbrella. Behind her, she heard nothing for a long moment. Then she heard the faint sound of paper unfolding. The note said, "4th floor. He's not waiting for a room." She did not look up for 4 minutes. When she finally did, she saw the man in the overcoat standing and buttoning his coat with an unhurried calm that somehow communicated everything. He said something to the man on his left, 2 words, "Quiet." The man nodded and disappeared down the corridor toward the stairwell entrance. The other 2 remained in the lobby. Vera stared at her screen and breathed. She had no idea if she'd just done something brave or catastrophic. The line between those 2 things had always seemed very thin to her. 20 minutes later, a door slammed somewhere above her. She heard it through the ceiling, muffled but unmistakable. Then voices too distant to make out, then nothing. Then the elevator descended to the lobby and the doors opened, and 2 of the men she hadn't seen leave came back through, moving quickly, flanking someone she didn't recognize. A heavy-set man in a dark jacket whose face had the particular blankness of someone who had recently realized the evening was not going as planned. The man in the overcoat appeared from the corridor a moment later. He stopped at the front desk. Vera looked up. "Thank you," he said. She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "You're welcome," because it was automatic. He looked at her for a moment, not the way men usually looked at her, not assessing her appearance, not cataloguing her usefulness. He was looking at her the way she looked at the lobby, like he was trying to understand the shape of something he hadn't expected. "What's your name?" he asked. "Just Vera." "Vera Calloway. How long have you worked here, Vera Calloway?" 2 years, and in 2 years you've learned to recognize things other people don't notice." It wasn't exactly a question. She answered it anyway. "I pay attention. I can see that." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a card. No name on it, just a phone number in black ink. He placed it on the desk between them. "If anything happens tonight, if anyone comes asking questions about what you saw, call that number." "I didn't see anything," Vera said. A brief pause. Something moved in his expression, brief as a shadow crossing a wall. It might have been the beginning of a smile. "Keep saying that," he said. And then he walked out through the revolving door into the November night, and the lobby felt very large and very quiet all at once. Vera looked at the card for a long time. Then she put it in the pocket of her uniform blazer and went back to updating the lost and found log. She didn't sleep when she got home at 7 in the morning. Teddy was already awake, eating cereal at their kitchen table with his backpack on because he had a 20-minute walk to school and always left early enough to stop at the bodega on the corner for a hot chocolate. He looked at her face and said, "You okay?" "Tired," she said. "Just tired?" He nodded, the easy acceptance of a younger sibling who had learned not to push. He kissed her on the top of the head, which he'd started doing about 6 months ago when he'd grown taller than her, and he left, and Vera stood in their small kitchen listening to the building settle around her. She tried to sleep. She lay on her bed with her shoes still on, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling that looked like a map of somewhere she'd never been. She kept running through the same sequence. The phone call, the men in the lobby, the note, the sound of the door slamming on the 4th floor. She kept thinking about what would have happened if she'd said nothing, if she'd just refilled the complimentary coffee and updated the umbrella entry and let whatever was going to happen, happen. She didn't know who those men were. She didn't know who the cash guest was or why someone had called him a target or what connections ran between them. She didn't know anything. She'd acted on instinct, and her instincts had been shaped by loss, and the loss had started 3 years ago in a hospital waiting room in Cleveland. Her mother had died at 51. The details were not unusual in their broad strokes. A woman who worked 2 jobs and didn't have good insurance and put off the doctor's visits until the putting off had cost her everything. What was unusual, or what had felt unusual to Vera, was what came after. The man her mother had worked for, a property manager named Dennis Holt, who had paid her under the table and promised benefits he'd never delivered, had come to the funeral. He'd shaken Vera's hand and told her what a wonderful woman her mother was. And then, 2 weeks later, when Vera had tried to recover the wages her mother was owed for her last 3 months of work, Dennis Holt had looked at her across his cluttered desk and said there were no wages owed because her mother hadn't been an employee in any documented sense. She'd had no recourse. She'd had a 17-year-old brother and $1,000 in checking, and a mother who had worked herself to death for a man who'd erased her from his records the moment she stopped being useful. There were people in the world who operated with complete confidence that they would never face consequences for what they did to other people. Vera had always known this in an abstract way. She understood it concretely now, in her bones. She had moved Teddy to Chicago because the cost of living was still brutal, but she had a cousin who'd helped her find the hotel job. And the hotel job had health insurance, and the health insurance covered Teddy's pulmonologist. And that was the calculation she lived inside of. Every decision ran through that calculation, every risk, every instinct, every late-night judgment call. She finally fell asleep a little after 9 and woke up at 2 in the afternoon to her phone buzzing on the nightstand. The number wasn't one she recognized. She almost didn't answer. Miss Calloway. The voice was the same one from the hotel lobby, measured, accented, impossible to read. I apologize for disturbing you. I imagine you've had a difficult morning. Vera sat up. How did you get this number? The same way I learned your name before you told it to me last night. A brief pause. I know that isn't reassuring. I'm not calling to reassure you. I'm calling because something has changed, and you deserve to know about it. She sat on the edge of her bed and pushed her hair back from her face. What changed? The man on the 4th floor. He wasn't working alone. There was a second person, someone inside the hotel, someone who has been in place for longer than last night. Another pause. I'm telling you this because his employer now knows that the operation failed, and they know that someone in the lobby warned us. They don't know who yet, but they will try to find out. The cold feeling she'd been carrying since the night before settled deeper. You're saying I'm in danger. I'm saying the possibility exists, yes, and I'd rather you know about it than not. Why? Why does it matter to you what I know? He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice had changed slightly, lost a degree of the careful control she'd heard in it before. Because you did something last night that you had no obligation to do. You put yourself at risk for someone you didn't know, for reasons I still don't entirely understand. I'd like to understand them if you're willing. Vera looked at the water stain on the ceiling. That seems like a longer conversation than a phone call. I agree. Would you be willing to meet? She thought about saying no. She thought about how much easier no would be. How she could hang up and call the hotel and quit and find something else. Somewhere quieter. Somewhere the geometry of power and danger didn't extend. She thought about that for 10 seconds. Then she said, "Where?" He named a restaurant on Michigan Avenue, the kind of place with white tablecloths and a menu printed in small fonts on heavy paper. It felt impractical for a conversation like the one she was imagining. Maybe that was the point. She wore her one good blazer, charcoal gray, and took the train and arrived exactly on time. His name, she had looked up in the 12 hours between the phone call and the restaurant, was Nicholas Caruso, Franklin Caruso's younger son. Franklin Caruso was a name that appeared in certain Chicago Tribune archives and certain federal court documents, always adjacent but never central, the way a shadow falls near a body without ever quite touching it. Nicholas Caruso was already at the table when she arrived. He stood when she approached, which she hadn't expected, and waited until she was seated before sitting down himself. "You looked me up," he said. "Of course I did, and you came anyway. I'm still deciding what that means," Vera said. He almost smiled. It was the same almost smile she'd seen in the hotel lobby, brief and restrained, like he'd learned to keep that particular expression under strict supervision. They ordered coffee. He asked her how she took it, and she said black, and he said the same, and there was a small, strange moment of recognition that she filed away and didn't examine. "Tell me why you did it," he said. Vera wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. The restaurant was warm, but she'd been cold all day. "I heard the phone call," she said. "The one that came through the hotel line earlier in the evening. The voice said the word target. Most people would have dismissed that, I know, but you didn't." "No." He waited. "My mother died 3 years ago," Vera said. "And the man responsible for her death, not directly, but in every way that matters, he's still running his business in Cleveland. He's still hiring women like her and promising them things and paying them in cash and then erasing them when they're gone. Nobody did anything about it. Nobody was going to do anything about it. and I had to move across the country and work nights and tell myself it was enough just to make sure Teddy was okay, and mostly I believed that. But the truth is, she paused, the truth is that I have a very hard time looking away when I see something happening to someone who doesn't know the danger is already inside the room with them. Nicholas Caruso looked at her steadily. Teddy is your brother. 17. He's asthmatic. He's good at math. He wants to study environmental science. She kept her voice even. He's the reason I get up at 5 in the afternoon and go to work at a hotel desk 6 nights a week. He's the reason for everything I do. Something shifted in the man's face across the table. She couldn't name it precisely. It was the look of someone who has just heard something they recognize at a cellular level. My father, he said after a moment, spent 20 years trying to protect people he loved by keeping them at a distance from the things he was involved in. He believed that distance was a form of safety, that if he could just keep the two worlds separate, nothing would cross over. He set his coffee cup down. He was wrong. The worlds don't stay separate. They never do. I watched that happen, and I swore I would do things differently, build something different, get out through the front door instead of hoping the back door held. He looked at her. Last night was supposed to be a meeting to finalize arrangements for exactly that, a handoff of information to a federal investigator who has been building a case against the organization that has been running operations in this city for years. The man on the 4th floor was supposed to make sure that meeting never happened. The organization, Vera said carefully. Is that something you can tell me about? His name is Rowan Steele. He runs everything from distribution to enforcement across 3 states. He's insulated, careful, and very patient. The federal case against him has been building for 18 months, and he's been systematically trying to eliminate the witnesses and cooperating parties who would make it stick. He paused. I am one of those cooperating parties. Vera absorbed this. You're turning on your own people, she said. I'm doing what my father should have done a long time ago. The evenness in his voice didn't waver. I'm not asking you to feel good about what I am, but I am asking you to understand that what happened last night matters, and what happens next matters more. What does any of this have to do with me? He leaned forward slightly. Steele's people now know that the operation failed. They know someone in that hotel lobby intervened. When they figure out who, and they will because they have a contact inside the hotel's management structure who will eventually access the personnel records and the security logs, you and your brother will become a liability to them. The cold feeling again. Deeper this time. You're telling me this is already my problem whether I want it to be or not, Vera said. Yes, I'm sorry, but hiding from it won't protect you, and I'd know. I watched someone I cared about try to hide from exactly this kind of threat. He stopped. The pause was longer than his other pauses. My sister, Elaine. She was a school teacher in Naperville. She witnessed a meeting she wasn't supposed to see, something peripheral, a handoff in a parking garage that she drove past at the wrong moment. She recognized one of the men involved because she'd seen him at my father's house. She told me about it. I told her not to worry, that I would handle it, that she should go back to her life. He looked at the table. I didn't handle it quickly enough. I'm sorry, Vera said. She meant it. So am I, every day. He looked up. You reminded me of her last night, not in how you look, in how you noticed, in the fact that you decided to act on what you noticed instead of looking the other way. Elaine would have done exactly what you did. She couldn't walk past something that was wrong without doing something about it. The restaurant murmured around them, silverware against plates, someone's quiet laughter 2 tables over, the ordinary sounds of people having ordinary evenings. What do you need from me? Vera asked. The federal investigator, her name is Agent Darby. She's been the primary contact on this case. She needs corroboration, witnesses who can place specific individuals in specific locations. You checked in the man on the 4th floor. You took his information. You saw his face. You heard the phone call that came through the hotel line. That's significant documentation. Combined with what I can provide, it may be enough to accelerate the timeline. Move against Steele before he has time to clean house. And if I say no, then I will do everything I can to protect you and your brother with my own resources. I won't leave you without options. But it will be slower and less certain, and Steele will still be operating. Vera thought about Dennis Holt in Cleveland. She thought about men who operated with certainty that they would never face consequences. She thought about her mother, who had worked until her body gave out, and who had never once been protected by anyone with the power to actually protect her. She thought about Teddy in his backpack, drinking his hot chocolate, not knowing that his sister had spent the last 24 hours in a situation she'd walked into sideways without meaning to. I want guarantees, she said. Real ones. My brother doesn't get touched. Not by Steele's people, not as collateral pressure, not as leverage. That's not negotiable, agreed. And I talked to Agent Darby before I agree to anything formal. I'm not signing my name to something based on a conversation in a restaurant. That's reasonable. And if at any point I decide this isn't working, I walk away and you help me relocate. Both of us. No questions, no complications. He looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that appeared when she said something that surprised him not by its content but by its precision. Agreed, he said again. Vera set down her coffee cup. Then I'll talk to Agent Darby. They met the federal investigator 2 days later in a conference room in a building in the Loop that looked aggressively forgettable from the outside, which Vera suspected was the point. Agent Sandra Darby was in her mid-40s, had the handshake of someone who had never once doubted herself, and spoke with the efficient warmth of a person who had learned to be both credible and human in the same conversation. She listened to Vera's account for nearly 2 hours. The phone call, the cash guest, the 4 men in the lobby, the note. She asked careful questions and took precise notes, and at the end of it she looked at Vera steadily and said, "You understand what you're committing to here?" "I think so," Vera said. "It's not a small thing. It will take time. There will be restrictions on your movements. There will be moments where this feels like a mistake." Darby paused. "But the case we're building against Steele's organization will hold, with your testimony and the documentation from Mr. Caruso's cooperation. We're talking about dismantling an infrastructure that has caused harm across 3 states for over a decade. Your contribution matters." Vera thought about a parking garage in Naperville and a schoolteacher who had noticed the wrong thing at the wrong time. "I know it matters," she said. "That's why I'm here." The next 6 weeks were strange and difficult and occasionally frightening. Vera and Teddy moved to a temporary residence, a house in Evanston that Darby's team maintained, the kind of place that looked so ordinary it seemed to be working hard at it. Teddy was told that there was a problem at the hotel, a general term that Vera felt guilty about but couldn't see around. He asked questions she deflected, and then, with the instinct he'd always had for the shape of what she wasn't saying, he stopped asking and started making sure she was eating. He was a good person. She thought about that a lot in those weeks. How her brother, who had lost the same things she'd lost and who had every right to be angry at the world, had instead become someone who made sure his sister was eating. She talked to Agent Darby twice a week. She talked to Nicholas Caruso more than she'd expected to. He called to check in, to relay information, to explain developments in a case she was now embedded in whether she wanted to be or not. Their conversations were professional. And then, gradually, in the spaces around the professional, they became something else. She learned that he had studied architecture before his family's circumstances pulled him in a different direction, that he cooked Italian food on Sunday mornings because it was what his mother had done, and it was the only thing that still felt like that specific kind of home, that he had not slept well in years, which she understood at a molecular level, and that he kept a photograph of his sister on the desk in his apartment and talked to it sometimes when he thought no one was listening. She told him about her mother, about the indignity of it, not just the loss but the erasure, the way someone could work themselves into an early grave and then be paper-clipped out of someone else's records and forgotten. She told him about learning to be invisible as a survival strategy and how she wasn't sure she knew how to stop. "You're not invisible," Nicholas said once, during one of the late phone calls that had started to happen after 10 p.m. when Teddy was asleep. "You were never invisible to people who were actually paying attention." She didn't answer that directly, but she thought about it for a long time after they hung up. The arrests came on a Tuesday in December, 3 days before the first snow of the season, coordinated across 2 cities. Rowan Steele was taken from his home in Lincoln Park at 6 in the morning. His lieutenants fell in rapid succession throughout the day, a domino chain that Darby's team had been engineering for 18 months, with precise, patient intention. Vera watched the news coverage from the Evanston house, Teddy beside her on the couch eating toast, not entirely sure what he was watching, but reading her face for signals. "Is it over?" he asked. "Most of it," she said, which was true in the ways that mattered most. She cried that night, alone in her room, the kind of crying that has nothing performative about it, that is just the body releasing something it's been holding for a very long time. She cried for her mother and for the wages that were never paid, and for the 3 years she'd spent making herself smaller and smaller, in the hope that smallness would keep her safe. She cried for Elaine Caruso, who had noticed something and hadn't been protected in time. She cried because it was over and she was still here, which was not something she had always been certain of. In the morning, she called Agent Darby, who told her the timeline for Teddy to go back to school and for Vera to return to her regular life, with the option of choosing a different regular life somewhere else if she wanted it. "Do you want it?" Darby asked. The relocation? Vera stood at the window of the Evanston house and looked at the bare trees and the grey December sky and the ordinary neighborhood going about its ordinary morning. "I want to think about it," she said. She called Nicholas Caruso that afternoon. "It's done," she said when he answered. "Yes." A pause. "How are you?" "Unsteady," she admitted. "But present, that's enough. For now, that's more than enough." Another pause. "I owe you something I don't entirely know how to give. You don't owe me anything. That's not true, and we both know it." She could hear something in his voice she hadn't heard there before. Something that had been kept under careful management and was now, cautiously, standing down. "I was wondering," he said, "whether you and your brother would consider having dinner, somewhere ordinary, no agendas, no case, no strategy, just a meal." Vera looked at the trees. "Teddy would eat anything that doesn't come out of a microwave," she said. "I make a very good carbonara." She laughed, an actual laugh, full and unguarded, the kind she'd almost forgotten she was capable of. "That sounds right," she said. "Sunday." "Sunday works." She hung up and stood at the window for another moment. In 3 years of keeping her head down and her profile low, and her world small enough to carry in one hand, she had constructed something that looked like a life from a certain angle. She could see now that it was more like a shelter than a life, something built to withstand, not to inhabit. She was tired of enduring. She was ready, tentatively, with appropriate caution that she doubted she would ever fully lose, to try something else. Teddy came into the kitchen and opened the refrigerator and announced that they were out of orange juice. "I'll get some," Vera said. "Right now?" "Right now." She got her coat from the hook by the door. The coat she'd had for 4 years, serviceable and grey, bought at a resale shop before she knew anything about Nicholas Caruso or Rowan Steele or late-night phone calls that started as professional and ended somewhere less definable. "Come with me." Teddy grabbed his jacket. "It's cold, I know. You're in a weird mood. A better one," she said. They walked out into the December morning and the air was sharp and clean, and Vera did not check over her shoulder once.